vintage Gucci is becoming incredibly popular again, but not every vintage Gucci piece, whether it's a wallet, a bag or a purse, is worth buying. So we've recently bought a big batch of vintage Gucci wallets and purses to add to our store. So we've been doing a lot of research into figuring out which styles are worth picking up. So if you're new here, my name is Gemma and me and my fiance James run a reselling business called House of Jams, where we resell vintage and luxury items. So why is vintage Gucci becoming popular again? So one of the things to think about, it has a really strong global brand recognition. So for example, the print, even the logo, people usually recognise it pretty easily and they can recognise it usually from afar as well. It has really timeless Italian classic designs, so they're usually quite luxurious, quite classic. They're not usually too trendy so that they go out of fashion too quickly. As I said, they're quite timeless. A lot of the materials that they use in the vintage pieces are a lot more durable and a lot better quality, so like the leather, the canvas and things like that. So that makes them a lot more, appealing to people as well. And they're actually becoming really collectible. So a lot of vintage pieces that, people are sourcing, they're not necessarily for them to wear, they're actually more for collectors because people seem to enjoy collecting them. And another thing to keep in mind as well is that usually the vintage pieces, I don't know if you've noticed this when you look at the styles and the designs, but the vintage Gucci pieces are a lot more distinctive than the modern pieces. I would say that the modern pieces, although they look classic and timeless, the vintage pieces do have something a little bit extra about them, and they make them, they do stand out a little bit. So that's another thing that makes them really, valuable, popular, and people are obviously interested, as I said before, in collecting them. So I thought it'd be useful to talk about the different vintage Gucci wallet or purse styles that sell really well. So if you're a reseller like me, then this is obviously something that will be really, really useful and important. However, even if you're buying vintage Gucci pieces for yourself, this is actually really useful to know for if you maybe do want to think about them as an investment piece, if you're maybe thinking about wanting to sell them off in the sell them in the future. This is actually really handy to know if you're trying to find some vintage Gucci pieces. Obviously, if you're buying them just for yourself, then you can obviously go for whatever style you like, but it's good to keep in mind. So the first style, which is really popular and is a really good sort of piece to buy to try and sell on, is the GG wallet. So this is the wallets that have usually the canvas on the outside, leather, trim or leather on the inside, and they usually have the Gucci like repeating pattern over the whole of the outside. They're usually in brown or sort of neutral kind of beigey kind of colours, and yeah, those ones are really popular, but they're also made of really good quality materials as well. So some of the reasons that this style of wallet is really popular is that the print and the style of that wallet is instantly recognisable. Like people, as I said, probably from afar, if you pull that out, they'll know that it's a Gucci wallet. So, people instantly recognise what it is. Obviously, the print on the outside, it's a really classic Gucci design. So it's very timeless, really classic, doesn't really go out of fashion. So it's always going to be quite popular and quite desirable. And going back to the print, as I said, on the outside, people just love that print. Like it's very, even though it's clear that it is a Gucci piece, it's also quite understated because it's not too in your face, it's quite subtle. So, but it's almost like subtle luxury, which, people really love that. So talking about subtle luxury, the next kind of piece, which is the leather wallets. So these are the ones that are usually just black or brown, plain or textured leather, and they have a very small subtle Gucci logo on it, usually metal on the outside. So as these have quite a simple, elegant design, they're very, understated. People who like understated luxury really like them. And because they're made of leather, they're also really durable, so they'll last long. So some of the colours to look out for with these leather wallets is obviously black, very classic, will go with everything. Dark brown and burgundy, which is obviously a little bit different. So definitely keep an eye out for these colours if you are looking for these kinds of wallets. So the next style to look out for is the Gucci zip around wallet. So that's the kind of wallets that have got the zip that goes round all the outside. So these are great because these are really functional. So they usually have a lot of card slots, a big coin compartment as well, and that's kind of the reason why they're really popular, is because they're very functional. They can be used every day. And you'll often find with the zip around wallets is these are more modern looking, so they appeal to sort of younger buyers, so definitely one to look out for as well. So I thought it'd also be useful to talk about the flip side and talk about some of the styles and things to kind of maybe not avoid, but if you are looking to resell them at any point, they might be a bit trickier to resell. So one of the things is anything that's got a loud print on it. So as I mentioned before, even though the canvas ones, the GG wallets, have got the print all on the outside, because they're usually brown and neutral colours, they are quite subtle, even though they have that print around the whole thing on the outside. So any prints that are a lot more louder, a lot brighter, those might be a little bit trickier to sell. The same with unusual colours. So as I mentioned before, black, brown, tan, beige, burgundy, those kind of colours are usually the ones to kind of look out for, and they're a lot easier to sell because people find them really wearable. But anything that is quite light, loud or bright colours or unusual colours, people sometimes find them a little bit trickier to imagine them wearing them. Obviously, if this is going to be for you and if you love the colour of the one that you've seen, then that's, don't worry about this. This is just more if you're thinking about, as an investment piece, or if you're thinking about selling it on later, just to keep in mind that unusual colours might be a little bit trickier to sell. Another thing to keep in mind is if you do come across any pieces that have really worn canvas, so usually on the wallet, when it folds, the crease that kind of where you're folding it in half, that's where you'll find that. So if the canvas is really, really worn, so much so that maybe the print is actually, disappeared a little bit, that can be a little bit, of a tricky thing to figure out if you're trying to sell it on, or if you're looking for it for yourself. Just keep in mind that, that could make it a little bit tricky to sell it on to someone else. The same with the leather. If you come across a piece that's maybe got really worn leather on the edge or on the corners, that's also something that can make it a little bit trickier to sell. But if you are reselling these pieces, just to make sure that you're being really transparent about any wear or damage or anything, and obviously you might need to adjust the price because of that, but as long as you do that, don't avoid these pieces, but it's just something to keep in mind. So if you do have some Gucci pieces of your own, or you're looking to buy some pieces, some of the things to look out for, especially when you're trying to figure out how much they might be worth, are things like the materials that are being made. So the canvas, the leather, things like that, how much of it is leather. Obviously things that are made of more leather are going to be worth a little bit more than if it's entirely made of canvas. And as we're talking about the materials it's made of, I mentioned before the condition of the materials. So the canvas, is it quite intact? Is it worn? Same with the leather. Is it, got any sort of wear or discoloration and things like that? Obviously, the more sort of colour, the less discoloration, the less worn it looks, the more valuable the piece is going to be. So looking at the stitching as well and seeing the state of the stitching is another thing that you would want to look at when you're trying to figure out the value. So is the stitching intact? Making sure that none of the stitches are coming loose or they're fraying or coming out. Obviously when you do get pieces, if you do notice there's some little threads and things, as long, you can even cut them off, as long as it's not obviously going to damage the item, just to neaten it up a little bit. So definitely check the stitching. Also looking at the hardware of the item as well, so the zips and things and the studs and stuff, making sure that it's all the original zips, and especially if the zips have the logos on them, obviously that's going to help with the value as well. And then obviously thinking about what colour it is, like what we mentioned before, and what kind of style it is. So classic colours such as black, brown, tan, burgundy, things like that, and classic styles that are more timeless, they're always going to be more valuable when it comes to vintage Gucci, rather than things that are quite bright, a bit obscure, a little bit maybe too in your face. So always go for the more classic looking pieces. So as Gucci is one of the most counterfeited designers or brands out there, knowing roughly how to check if a piece is authentic is also something that is really useful to know. So as we mentioned before, all the things that you're going to be looking at to sort of try and help you figure out the value of your pieces, you're also going to be looking at those things to help you figure out if the piece is authentic. So looking at things, as I said, like the stitching, if it's going to be stitching together leather or leather and canvas, obviously the stitches are going to have to be really good quality, quite thick, really sort of held together really well. You're also going to be looking at the hardware, so things like zips, studs and buttons quite often, even on the sort of under part of the zip of the stud. I'm not too sure what it's called. Obviously on your stud that you have on the outside will normally have Gucci or a logo or something on it, but when you lift the stud up, it's usually written on the other part of the stud as well. And if you do have zips, they might have the logos on them. Obviously not all the zips will and not all the studs will, but the more logos and the more branding there is really will help with helping to authenticate the item. Also looking inside for, you know, the printed Gucci name and things like that. And then looking at the material quality as well. So if you know what good quality leather feels like in canvas, obviously if it feels nice and thick and durable and things like that, then that's obviously going to help with, you know, figuring out if it's authentic. And if something feels not right, if you think it feels quite cheap, like it's not real leather, or if it's not, you know, quite durable canvas and things like that, you know, trust your gut. It, you know, potentially might not be authentic. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we have actually recently bought a whole batch of vintage Gucci wallets and purses that we're going to be adding to our shop, and we do plan on sharing when we get those and how we go about listing them and things like that, and if we do have to maybe sort of do anything to them to try and like obviously spruce them up a little bit, because they are vintage pieces, so there might be pieces that are a little bit worn and things. So yeah, so if you found this video useful or interesting, make sure and hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, especially if you don't want to miss our future videos about when we do get our own vintage Gucci wallets. And I'll see you in our next one.